it's David Palmer and Leo King, and this is my first live stream finally here at UAC 2018. If you don't know what UAC is, it's the United Astrology Conference, and it's really cool. It's like the Olympics of astrology, that's what I like to call it. And there's a lot of awesome astrology here, there's a lot of awesome astrologers, and I've got one of my favorite astrologers in the world, Mann here. How you doing, Tad?
Very well, Dave. Nice to be here.
Yeah, so why don't you tell everybody, a little bit about your background in astrology and what you're doing here at the conference.
Yeah, well, I was originally an architect, and then I made a kind of transition because I realized that I was more interested in time than space, and so I began investigating astrology and got hooked very, very quickly 45 years ago.
Wow.
And it really resonated with me. In fact, I felt as though I was remembering it rather than learning it. So that was a really good thing, and I was at the time very much influenced by the psychology of Carl Jung, but also an amazing mystic called George Gurdjieff. And the Gurdjieffian technique was very interesting because it was about time, and also they postulated that our life doesn't begin at birth but at conception.
Yeah.
And they had a wheel of the lifetime, and it was interesting because the time sense was very different. It was logarithmic. So when you're young, days last forever, and as you get older, it speeds by. So I applied this to the chart, and I discovered that you could actually date when planets in the chart register in your lifetime, all the way back to the time you're conceived. And I began testing it, and I realized very quickly that not only was it accurate, but it forced me to start learning about biology and psychology and time and history, and eventually it led into areas like astrology and reincarnation. So I actually practice as an astrologer still. I've written lots of books, and it's interesting because astrology brings everything together.
I was just going to say that all those things that you brought up about history and time and even biology, and all those answers kind of form into astrology at one place.
They actually do, and it makes a lot of sense. And I discovered that, you can find astrology in the I Ching, in Chinese mysticism, in Hindu mysticism, in Tibetan Buddhism, and that's actually one of the wonderful things about it, because you can link it to almost everything, because it's about humans and the heavens. And I really do think, science hasn't really touched our behavior very deeply, because it's very difficult to pin down exactly who people are.
That's very true.
One of the principles of Tibetan Buddhism, which I practice, is that we don't have a self. We have a series of selves, and those selves develop or they stay stagnant, but we always see ourselves differently. And that I developed a kind of astrology I call lifetime astrology, that it's more dynamic, meaning it takes into consideration the fact actually we're always changing, and the problem is when we stop.
That's true, and I've always actually I followed a lot of that astrology that you created with, originally it was on the WinStar program, right, with Mike Erlewine.
Right, that's right.
And when I was working with Matrix Software, he showed me that, and that's actually how I met you, was seeing that, and blew my mind, because I think I think time is so hard. It is the fundamental part of astrology, and I think that there's so many different ways to look at it, and I think you bring a very good way of looking at it in a way that really tries to understand these different parts, that it's not just so the same all the time, or you bring a lot of eclectic aspects to time.
Well, that's why you and I get on so well together, because I like the idea that taking on new things, new directions all the time. And you're always actually, because the way someone is now is not the same as it was a year ago or 5 years ago.
Never.
And so the people that are most interesting in life, and the part of us that's most interesting, is when we shift and move into new territory and play around with things. Because it's ironic that a lot of traditional astrologers, they're really looking to try to pin down who you are. And I think that's a kind of impossible task.
It is a very impossible task, because every day, we think we might look the same, but there's always some aspect of ourselves just physically changing, spiritually changing, emotionally changing. Like, I came to this conference thinking I was going to feel a certain way, and I'm not. I'm feeling a totally different way than I feel. So there's no way to really ever really pinpoint down. I think, like you say, as the whole world is ever changing, the trees change all the time. I mean, there really is nothing that is very stagnant. Even the biggest rocks on this planet, you'll see the layers of the rocks.
That's
I mean, it's amazing to see.
Yeah, well, the whole point is that when you stop changing is when things become static.
Yeah.
And you start getting into trouble and you feel blocked and you feel bored. I've never been bored, and I doubt you have either.
No.
Because we're both Leos, by the way.
Yeah, I was going to
people.
say, you're actually in the right booth. You know?
Yeah, I only have 5 planets in fire, so no.
Oh, that's it? So what are the lectures that you're doing here at UAC?
Well, I'm doing lectures about my work, but particularly about the symbolism behind the stages of gestation. Like, you know, like what happens from the time we're born until from the time we're conceived until the time we're born. Because it includes our parents' sexuality, it's a measure of our sexuality. It's also about, I realize that gestation in a person's life is actually a pattern of their creativity, meaning we conceive something, an idea, and you know, you and I, for example, we conceive something, we immediately recognize it, we begin letting it gestate and it finds different forms, and then at some point we birth it.
Right.
You know, and so I basically am working with that because it actually helps a lot of creative people. A lot of my clients are very creative people.
Yeah.
So it's a very interesting dynamic.
I think it is. We had a little convo last night. You know, I had brought up that I was born, cesarean, right? Like I was just kind of pulled out.
Right.
So it's a little bit easier than somebody who might have had a harder time getting out of the womb, right?
That's
and
right.
how they deal with their life in certain aspects.
So that's
that.
like an instant response to things that are environmental.
Yeah.
You know, like some people have a very long labor, which in astrology is having Saturn on the Ascendant.
Oh, yeah.
And that means they want to get to know you before they even open up. And sort of, there's a lack of connectedness, or Neptune, which interestingly enough comes up in a lot of the charts of people who are creative. Neptune on the Ascendant means that as you were being born and the peristaltic action was pushing you out, suddenly the doctor administers an anesthetic and you get stuck in the birth canal. And that creates people who have great skills, but when it comes to actually doing it and producing it out in the world, they freeze.
Right, yeah.
So they need to be directed to therapies that are around that push you through. So,
because Neptune can be very paralyzing, right? I mean, literally.
it can be paralyzing, it can be addictive, and it can also be extremely spiritual.
Yeah.
And in fact, they're all basically addictions.
Well, what would you say about, like, because I have Mercury on my Ascendant. What would you kind of think that maybe, I don't know.
Well, I think either your mother was talking the whole time or someone was talking her through it.
Yeah. So it was a cesarean. It was really fast. It was like 8 a.m., 8:05, you're out, done, bye. You know,
You know, she might have been, knowing you, she might have been negotiating how this was going to happen.
Well, I do have a Virgo mother, too, Mercury on the Ascendant. But
She would have been very particular about how she wanted this process to work.
Yeah.
So the good thing about it is that the way your mind works is integral to who you are.
Right, yeah.
It's like there's like no division between the two.
At all.
Whereas for a lot of people, the way they think and communicate is very different than how they really are. And also Pluto is the public.
Yeah.
So when you have Mercury-Pluto conjunct, it indicates that when you communicate things, you communicate them to everyone.
Right.
In fact, one of the Eberton, the German astrologer, calls Mercury-Pluto the propagandist.
I like that. That's
meaning that it's the things you think and the things you express, you intend it to be put on and directed towards a lot of people.
Right.
And so with that aspect, I have a semi-square between the two.
Oh, okay.
But it's a little distant, so I'm not quite as in there as you are. But you know, it's fascinating to see these things because it affirms who we are.
Yeah.
So anyway, speaking of which,
tell everybody about what you're doing in New York this summer.
There's a wonderful museum in New York called the Rubin Museum of Himalayan art. And apart from the fact that I practice Tibetan Buddhism and also paint mandalas, it's actually a wonderful museum because they have a very complete program of speakers. And their theme this year is the future. And so I got invited to curate 6 programs in July and August.
Huh? Oh yeah, I'll hold it up.
6 programs in July and August about astrology, prophecy, and divination with AT Mann, which is me. So I'm going to be having conversations, dialogues with a Tibetan Buddhist Lama, with a Peruvian shaman, with an amazing Siberian shamaness. And it's going to be very, very interesting because it's really, this Rubin Museum attracts very high-level people in New York.
Yeah.
People that practice Tibetan Buddhism, but also a lot of intellectuals, and and it's an opportunity to really show that astrology and prophecy and divination all come from the same root.
Yeah, they all come from,
A lot of people think about these things as superstition or, there's something strange about them, but I believe, because I was an architect and because I have made a lot of imagery that shows the way my ideas work, that I'm going to show people how divination and astrology and prophecy fit together. And so if you happen to be in New York, any of you, they're Wednesdays throughout July and August, and the Rubin Museum is spelled Rubin, and they have a wonderful website, rubinmuseum.org.
Perfect.
Check it out.
Yeah, I think it's great. I was actually looking at this artwork here, and as you're talking about your architecture background and you're talking about how all this connects, a lot of this reminds me of a lot of the stuff that was going on even when our country was built with the Freemasons and a lot of the geometry that's based upon all that, and how I believe that the harmony in the world is when, a lot of, whether it's math or whether you call it science, but divination, there's an artwork in it that is so beautiful, whether you look at the cycles of Venus or you look at, it's everywhere, right? And I think it's interesting in how the way that you've got this displayed and how you're going to be showing people this actually in museum and talking about it is a connection to it all in the most beautiful way, and especially with your Tibetan Buddhist background, which, I'll be honest, not a lot of people, especially here in the first world, right, or the Western world, it's not a very easy thing to get into.
No, it's not.
Or understand, so you could be there to help people understand
That's
it, right?
This is actually, the diagram is a memory theater. And Shakespeare's plays never had any stage directions. So this shows a theater that's based around astrological principles. And
interesting.
These are all the aspects, the black and white squares.
Oh, got you.
And the orchestra where people sit are the king in the middle and the queen and the ladies around him. They're rings of the planets. And you can move around the stage based on the way you're being directed in the play. And the audience sits according to their signs.
That's great, yeah.
So the idea of these talismans and mandalas is that, it's a way of visualizing quite complicated ideas.
But once you see the whole picture and then you understand it, it gives you an overall comprehension of it all in such a powerful way that, it makes sense. For me, if you actually look at this imagery, I've seen it when I look at a lot of the artwork of how the old astrology was and the understandings of the planet rotations and the way that they thought that the Earth was, especially when they thought it was a flat Earth, It's interesting to see this same kind of imagery.
Absolutely.
And now there's so many beautiful ways to express this magic, I like to call it, and find ways to make it understandable in lots of different ways.
Absolutely. And in fact, this is a Greek theater, but it was revisioned by a Renaissance architect, Palladio. And so I really do think that the visual part of things is really powerful. A friend of mine and I worked on a documentary recently with the Dalai Lama about neuroscience and meditation. And in research, I was the main researcher, but in research I discovered that, and this is amazing, 80% of our brain neurons are devoted to processing vision.
Wow.
So if you think about it, we're sitting here in this room, but we have a sense of where we are in space, and our brain is like checking it all out. So in doing what you do out on the water, you got to be quick with your mind to be able to navigate that.
It's true.
But anyway, so those of you out there, come to a UAC conference.
Yeah, and because you can't see it in front of us right now, but there's hundreds of people right around us right now. There's hundreds of vendors. There's tons of lectures going on, and then at night we all love to hang out. That's the best part. My favorite is always at night.
Of course,
I think for Leos at least, we love social time.
Yeah, because we're so shy.
Yeah, we're so shy, and we don't want to talk to anybody.
Right. But also, what an interesting thing you see at a conference like this is every astrologer has quite a different way of seeing everything.
Oh, 100%.
There are as many astrologies as there are astrologers, practically.
And what I like about these conferences is most people aren't, pushing. They're usually asking others how they look at it.
Absolutely.
Instead of kind of saying, no, this is how I'm looking at it. You always will notice everybody's asking the other person the questions, which for me, I love, because it's like, I love asking you, well, what do you think about Mercury on my ascendant when my mom was born during your gestation period astrology that you figured out? It's like, I don't want to try and figure that out on my own, because I want to hear it from you. So there's that beautiful aspect of exchange here, which I love.
Yeah, and we find people that know a lot about things we don't know much about.
Yeah, that's true.
That's a great way to expand the range.
Yeah, well, I've always thought you were wonderful. You've always been so kind. I love all your work. You have such great work, especially if for all the people out there that love astrology. Check out, all of his stuff, because he's done many books, and especially if you get into these software programs, there's stuff that they based all of their stuff on his work.
Absolutely. And my website is atmann.net. It's that simple.
Yeah, and actually you should get a reading with him, because I've gotten a reading with him before, and it was great.
Right.
So.
Well, listen, thanks, Dave.
Of course, no
problem,
problem,
been a real
Tad.
pleasure,
I always enjoy you.
And we'll hang out later.
Yeah, well, we'll hang out later. Wish we could hang out with you guys again, too, but
yeah, thank you.
At least you guys can rewatch it. Thanks again.
Wonderful.
Man. Yeah.